Hey, and welcome to another video from our Diversity and Inclusion Short Input series. My name is Nina Kiel and I'm the Head of Diversity and Inclusion at Flying Sheep Studios in Cologne. So in case you've missed the introductory talk on why you should care about diversity and inclusion, please make sure to check it out first. You'll find the link in the description below. Now, today's short input is dedicated to gender-inclusive language, and we're going to focus on English and German because these are the two languages we speak at Flying Sheep. But it would be very interesting to discuss other languages as well. So if you speak another language and would like to share some information about how it deals with gender, feel free to leave a comment under the video. Now, as you probably know, many, if not most, languages are heavily gendered. And that is especially true for German. So many of us, including myself, sometimes really struggle when trying to use gender-inclusive or even gender-neutral language. Unfortunately, there are no perfect solutions to this problem, but I can at least offer you some helpful suggestions and approaches to languages that you can adapt if you want to. But before we delve into this, I'd really like to stress that it's completely fine to make mistakes. It's actually very likely that you won't be able to adapt these approaches right away. Because after all, you've been using gendered language for decades probably, and changing habits is really hard, especially if you adapted them at an early age. What's most important, in my opinion, is the intention to change and that you don't stop trying, even if it feels awkward at first. So with that being said, let's first have a look at the English language. And the biggest advantage that English speakers have is that the language actually offers a very simple way to remove gender altogether, and that is the singular they. So the singular they is often falsely considered to be a modern invention, but it has actually been in consistent use as a singular pronoun since the late 1300s. And it's mostly used when the gender of a person is either unknown or just not relevant. So here's an example. Ask each of the students what they want for lunch. So in this case, you need that information, what the people want to eat, but it's really not important what gender they have because you just want to know their food preferences, right? So nowadays, the singular they as a pronoun is also used for and by non-binary people. And to give you an example of that, I love Jay's work. They are so talented. So in this case, unlike in the previous example, they actually refers to just one individual. But even without this option, even without the gender-neutral they, individuals as well as groups of people can easily be described in English without referring to gender. So another example, the doctors really helped me, or Melinda is a great teacher. If you pick the same examples and translate them into German, it's not possible to make these sentences gender neutral because there's no equivalent to the singular they, and nouns are always gendered too in German. So if you want to translate these sentences, it would likely be Die Ärzte haben mir sehr geholfen and Melinda ist eine großartige Lehrerin. So we have to refer to gender in some way and often have to make assumptions about a person's gender. Now, it's often argued that the generisches Maskulinum or the generic masculine that we used in the example of the doctors is actually gender neutral because it only refers to grammatical gender. But studies have shown in the past that it actually influences the perception of gender by people. And more specifically, people who read or hear the generic masculine more often think of men, especially when it's used in contexts or for professions that are historically dominated by men. And other studies suggest that children are more likely to consider a future career in a certain field if jobs are presented with gender-inclusive language. And this is why in recent years, a number of ways to change the German language and make it more inclusive have been introduced. So let's first talk about gendern. or entgendern. Since it's actually the process of removing gender specifics from language, entgendern might be a more precise way to describe it. And there are a lot of different approaches to that. So, for example, we can use participial constructions. Instead of Lehrer, we can say Lehrende, a person who does teach. Then there's also neutral alternatives to gendered words. For example, Lehrkraft instead of Lehrer. But especially in this case, there's limited use. If you try to use that consistently, sometimes it feels and sounds very awkward. Then there's the so-called Binnen-I or capital I. However, the limitation in this case, even though it has been widely used in the last decades, is that it only refers to male and female, so it's not as inclusive. It's different with the asterisk, the underscore, and the colon, which are widely used to make language more inclusive, because these symbols are supposed to mark a space between male and female and essentially make room for other gender identities. So, to give you an example on how to actually say this, meine LehrerInnen haben mich immer unterstützt. When you use these symbols in spoken instead of written language, they are verbalized as a short break or a so-called glottal stop. And this glottal stop is actually used in many different languages for different reasons. And in German, it occurs in words like überall or Spiegelei. So it's actually not entirely new. So let's try that again. We could say ÄrztInnen, LehrerInnen, or SpielerInnen as a more inclusive form to refer to people. Now, so far I've used only the plural form, but actually this can also be used in the singular form. For example, you could say Lehrerin or Spielerin. Now, this really takes some time getting used to. I can say that from experience. It felt awkward at first, but it's starting to feel natural after a while, and then you don't even have to think about it anymore. It works. The problem with these, and especially with the colon, is that some accessibility issues can come up, especially for screen readers, which can't properly translate many of these forms. So disability advocates discourage the use of the colon, this form in particular. While the asterisk is considered to be not ideal in terms of accessibility, but probably the best form we have right now. Still, there's still a lot of backlash against gendern or entgendern, mostly from conservatives, who argue that language shouldn't adapt to new perspectives on gender. But what these people fail to understand is that language has never been a static concept. It can't be preserved because it always evolves and changes, and it adapts to new concepts, as you can clearly see, for example, in the context of the internet, specific internet speech, technical jargon, and so on. And gender-inclusive language makes people more visible who in the past have often been neglected. That's especially true for genderqueer people. This is why queer people, in particular, took matters into their own hands and created neopronouns. So neopronouns are third-person personal pronouns that go beyond he, she, or even they. And they are most often used by non-binary and genderqueer people who feel that these pronouns provide options to reflect their gender identity more accurately than conventional pronouns. And just like the singular they, neopronouns have actually been around much longer than most people think, because they date back to at least the 18th century. But the term neopronoun itself has been actually coined much later, in the 2010s. Now, there are so many neopronouns nowadays that we can't possibly go through all of them. This is just a selection, actually. But I've added a comprehensive list to the resource section that is linked below the video, so you can browse through them yourself if you want, if you just want to educate yourself further, or if you're looking for a new pronoun for yourself. Neopronouns have many pros and cons, because on the one hand, for example, they offer people more freedom to express themselves, which is a good thing. But on the other hand, many of them are really difficult to use and they have to be explained to most people because knowledge on neopronouns is still very limited outside the LGBTQI communities. So unfortunately, they are not really widely used, and in most everyday cases, people will be very confused if you introduce yourself with any of those. But of course, this could be changed if people use them more continuously. Now, to wrap up this talk, I'd like to give you some general advice on how to make your language more inclusive in everyday communication. The first important step is to simply ask people for their pronouns. Ask someone what pronouns they're using and use these pronouns from there on. But please don't pressure them because some people don't want to disclose their pronouns for a number of reasons. Maybe they're not out. Maybe they just don't want to use any pronouns. So ask politely, but also just accept it if they don't want to give them their pronouns. And in that case, try to refer to them as gender neutrally as possible. Also, please consider sharing your own pronouns, especially if you ask someone else, because especially when you're cisgender, using your pronouns, sharing your pronouns normalizes talking about them. And that can help genderqueer and trans people to open up because they are not the only ones who use them and who are highlighted as different, which is often the case in introductory rounds, unfortunately. More generally, I strongly suggest using gender-neutral language for people whose gender identity you don't know, because it's always best not to make assumptions. There's no reliable way to determine someone's gender or sex just by looking at them or based on their name. You simply cannot know. Now let's have a look at some English language options. So again, an advice from my side would be to use the singular they whenever applicable. So for example, if you don't know a person well, if you don't know their pronouns because you didn't have an opportunity to exchange pronouns, you could use that one. To give you an example sentence, I was briefly introduced to Thomas yesterday. They seem nice. But maybe a person just doesn't want to use any pronouns, or you don't really know about their preferences, so you want to avoid the singular they as well. In that case, you could just use and repeat the first name of that person. So here's an example. In the case of Mark, Mark doesn't want to use any pronouns, so you could say, I've got a birthday cake from Mark. Mark makes the best cakes. It can be a bit awkward to repeat a person's first name over and over and over again, but it's also just something you can get used to, and if the other person prefers that, it's fine. When you're corresponding with a stranger, try to not use gendered form of address. So, for example, when you're writing a letter or an email, don't write Dear Mr., Mrs., Mrs., and make assumptions based on their first name, but instead consider writing something like Dear first name, last name, which is something that I usually do. And there are actually many more options than that. I just wanted to give you a couple of them. So if you want to know more, you can, for example, check out the inclusive writing guidelines of the Canadian government, which has published a great resource called The Inclusionary that offers gender-neutral alternatives for gendered words like businessman or other words, and also different kinds of address that you can use in your everyday life. These resources are linked in the resource section below, so make sure to check them out. Okay, now let's talk about the German language, which, as I mentioned before, is heavily gendered, but actually we can use some of the same options as we can in English language. So again, you can always avoid using pronouns and use the first name instead. So in the case of our earlier example, you can say, ich wurde Thomas vorgestellt, Thomas scheint nett zu sein. Again, also like in English, it makes sense to avoid gendered forms of address in emails, in letters, and so on. And In German, you have to make just a small modification to make this form of address gender neutral or more inclusive. So you can write sehr geehrt er Vorname Nachname and use the asterisk that I introduced to you before. You can also use neutral terms like Person or Mensch. So for example, when someone helped you with your luggage at the train station and you don't know anything about that person, then when meeting a friend and telling them about it, you could say, diese Person hat mir eben beim Tragen meines Koffers geholfen. Das war total nett. So you don't make any assumptions about the gender of that person. And when you are referring to groups of people, then you can actually use the glottal stop or participial constructions like die SpielerInnen or die Spielenden. And again, these are just a couple of options. There are more, and if you'd like to learn more about gender-inclusive German specifically, I've provided resources for that as well, as you can see in this list, but of course there are many more. Feel free to do some research. So I linked the resources below the video. Make sure to check them out. And that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.